Ted Bundy, born Theodore Robert Cowell, was born in Burlington, Vermont, on the 24th of November 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Maternity Home, a home for unwed mothers. When Ted was born, his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, who was known as Louise, was 22, unmarried, and alone. Ted's father was absent and to this day is unknown. Although there's a disturbing theory that Louise was raped and sexually abused by her father and that Ted's biological father is also his grandfather. There are also other rumors that his father was in the Navy and did not want any involvement in his life. After Ted was born, Louise moved in with her parents in Philadelphia. They were from a very religious family, and having a baby out of wedlock was not socially accepted. So, Ted was raised by his grandparents and he knew Louise as his older sister. Life in this household was not pleasant, as Ted's grandfather was a very violent and frightening man who was known to kick dogs, swing cats by their tails and physically abuse people who angered him. When Ted was 3 years old, he placed kitchen knives around his auntie who was sleeping, and when she woke up, she saw all the knives surrounding her, then saw Ted standing next to her smiling. Not only did he have a fascination with knives, but Ted was also exposed to his grandfather's pornographic magazines, and was obsessed with it. When Ted was 4 years old, him and his mother Louise moved to Tacoma, Washington. Louise met a man called Johnny Bundy at a singles night at their local church. Johnny was a cook at a local veterinarian hospital. He was handsome and did not take long for him to strike up a conversation with Louise, which led to a romantic relationship and married a year later. Once they were married, Johnny adopted Ted, and from here on, Ted was now known as Ted Bundy. Johnny and Louise would have 4 of their own children. And growing up, Ted didn't accept his stepfather, mainly because he was a working-class man and not wealthy. And as Ted longed for that wealthy lifestyle, he refused to take part in their family outings because he didn't want to be known as middle class. Ted attended Wilton High School and had above-average academic intelligence, but didn't succeed in the physical education. He was not chosen to be on the basketball or baseball team, and he was not very good at being a Boy Scout. He was not a popular student and didn't have many friends, and was teased for his speech impediment. Ted was known to be quite violent and enjoyed scaring his classmates. Ted was also known to be a compulsive liar and had a fascination with violence and pornography. He became socially withdrawn and was known to be very sensitive with a lot of insecurities. Ted would later confess that he never really knew who he was, or whom he belonged to. During his high school years, he was arrested several times for suspicion of burglary and auto theft, but once he turned 18, these arrests were removed from his records. He graduated high school in 1965 and then enrolled himself at the University of Puget Sound in Washington. He spent a year here, then transferred to the University of Washington, where he was studying Chinese. And he transfers to the University of Washington in Seattle, where he meets his first love, Diane Edwards. Ted was immediately smitten by her beauty, intelligence, money and class. Ted wanted everything she had. Soon enough they began a romantic relationship. They were both very much in love, but Ted had fallen harder. Diane was like no other girl he had ever seen before, and he considered her the most sophisticated, the most beautiful creature possible. Diane ended their relationship in the early 1970s, as she did not see Ted fitting into her life and couldn't see Ted being her future husband. This had a profound impact on Ted, and he later cited that his failed relationship with Diane was a significant turning point in his life, and had a lasting impact on him. It was later believed that Ted would only choose his victims who resembled her. In 1968, Ted was working on the Nelson Rockefeller presidential campaign for the re-election of Dan Evans. While Ted was working on the campaign, he gained friends to which he would go to church with them, go to their house for parties and even attend social events. They knew him as a nice, articulate, smart, kind man, who could not do no harm. Ted was then appointed to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, and later was employed as Ross Davis' assistant, the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. While working here, Ted wrote a pamphlet on rape prevention. So, for the people that knew Ted in a social and professional manner, he was thought to be a rising star. But while he was fooling everyone into thinking that he was a kind man, he was peeping through windows of women's homes, had an obsession with pornography, and would steal from homes and stores. One night in October of 1969, Ted met Elizabeth Klopfer at the Sandpiper Tavern in Seattle. Elizabeth was a 24-year-old, single mother from Utah who was working as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Ted saw Elizabeth from across the room, and noticed how well-dressed and beautiful she was. He walked over to her and asked her to dance. They instantly had a connection. Their relationship sparked and Ted became the loving husband and father figure she had always wanted. He made her feel loved. Their relationship grew strong very quickly, with meeting Ted's parents in the first few months and even discussed marriage. They were in love. However, their relationship had its challenges too. Ted would be emotionally and verbally abusive towards Elizabeth and would threaten her. Ted was also very jealous and possessive, and would become angry and suspicious if Elizabeth had spoken to another man. After one fight they had, Ted angrily locked Elizabeth outside in the cold for hours before letting her back in the house, and when he did, he was back to the warm, loving man she loved. Ted even trapped the room she was sleeping in with smoke, in an attempt to kill her, but it was only the fact that Elizabeth woke up in a panic and couldn't breathe, that she is alive. His behavior was becoming disturbing, and he started disappearing for long periods of time without explanation. Ted's abusive and absent behavior began Elizabeth's alcohol addiction. In 1971, Ted got a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Center, and here he met a woman called Ann Rule, who became very good friends with Ted. In 1972, he graduated from the University of Washington with a psychology degree, then enrolled into law school at the University of Puget Sound. Over the next few years, while attending law school, Ted was known to skip his classes, and then over a period of time, he would stop going to classes altogether. In the year of 1974, women across Seattle started going missing. Linda Ann Healy was a 21-year-old woman from an upper-class family in Newport, Bellevue. She had long auburn hair, blue eyes, and was very popular. She was a psychology student at the University of Washington in Seattle, and worked 5 days a week on the radio as the ski reporter, and would often work with disabled children in her spare time. Linda was loved by everyone. On the 30th of January 1974, Linda started her day at 5:30 a.m. She went to her job at Northwest Ski Reports, then attended her university classes, and then went to the grocery store, before arriving home. Once she was home, her and her roommates all decided to go out for a few drinks at Dante's Tavern. This was a bar that Ted frequently visited. After they had a few drinks, Linda walked home and got back to her house at around 10 p.m. She spoke to her boyfriend on the phone for an hour, then she spoke to her roommate for a bit, before going to her bedroom, which was in the basement. This was the last time Linda was seen alive. Ted more than likely followed her home, and waited until the lights were out and there were no noises. He checked the front door and it was unlocked. He walked through the house and went down the stairs to Linda's room in the basement. Ted confessed to choking Linda, then moved her off the bed and onto the floor. He striped her nightie off and hung it back in the closet. He then made the bed, almost in a military fashion. The corners were tucked and the cover was over the pillow. Ted picked Linda up, carried her through the house and out the front door. He then put her into his car and drove away. On the 31st of January 1974, she was reported missing. But she was already dead. When police searched her room, they noticed blood stains on her nightie and the head of the bed. They also discovered that some of her clothes were missing, along with a satin pillowcase and a backpack. Even though Ted and Linda attended the same university, Ted was never considered a suspect, as they had never met. Linda's body remains would only be found over a year later, in Taylor Mountains, 23 miles east of Seattle. While the police were investigating the disappearance of Linda, they noticed few connections between Linda's case and another case that only occurred 3 weeks prior, to a young woman named Karen Sparks. Karen was an 18-year-old dancer who also attended the University of Washington. She lived in a campus home, and her bedroom was also in the basement. She lived there with 3 men, and her house was only 11 blocks away from Linda. 1 a.m., on the 4th of January, Ted was staring through the basement window, looking at Karen. Shortly after, he entered her room, grabbed a metal rod from her bed frame, and brutally bashed her head. Once she was unconscious, he raped her so brutally that she suffered from severe internal damage. Ted left the house, leaving Karen unconscious and bleeding until 7 p.m. the following night, and she was only found as one of her roommates checked on her. Karen was hospitalized and her attack was so brutal that she was in a coma for 10 days. When she woke up, she had no memory of the event and was left with permanent disabilities. Almost 2 weeks later, on the 12th of March, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen College, was last seen at 7 p.m. on her way to a folk dancing class on campus. Ted had abducted her between her dorm and the activities center. And it wasn't until 6 days later that her friends had reported her missing. Her body still has not been found. 1 month later, on the 17th of April, Suzanne Rancourt, an 18-year-old student from the Central Washington University campus in Ellensburg, was washing her clothes in the laundry room. Then at approximately 8 p.m., she left to attend a meeting at the Munson Hall. The meeting had finished at 10 p.m., so she began walking back to the laundry room to pick up her clothes. However, Suzanne never got her clothes. Ted intercepted Suzanne walking by herself near the Munson Hall. Ted was wearing a sling over his arm and pretended to struggle carrying his books. Suzanne offered help, and Ted accepted. They walked across the campus to the parking lot, where Ted had parked his VW Beetle. As Suzanne placed his books in his car, Ted grabbed his crowbar and hit her unconscious. Ted put her body in the car and drove away. It was 10 months after Susan's abduction. They found part of her yellow jacket and her skull at Taylor Mountain. Almost 3 weeks later, on the 6th of May, Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 20-year-old student from the Oregon State University in Corvallis, 250 miles south of Seattle, was walking to the Memorial Union building when she stopped to talk to her friend Lorraine. They talked about their Spanish test that was soon, and that she was going to get a hot fudge sundae. This was the last time Roberta was seen alive. Ted saw Roberta sitting alone in the cafeteria, eating her sundae, so he walked up to her and sat beside her. Ted had convinced Roberta to join him into Corvallis to get some food and drinks. They walked across campus to his VW Beetle. When Ted started driving, he lied and told Roberta that he needed to collect his thesis, but instead, drove out to a secluded area where he attacked her. When Roberta was reported missing, police did not link her case to the other missing women from Seattle, as she went missing so far away. It was not until authorities found her skull at Taylor Mountain did they connect her death to Ted. On the 31st of May, Brenda Ball, a 22-year-old, free-spirited woman, was drinking at the Flame Tavern in Berrien. The Flame Tavern was known for its live music and had a reputation of being a rough place. Meanwhile, Ted was having dinner with Elizabeth and her parents. Once they finished dinner, Ted left in a hurry. Ted got to the bar, where witnesses saw Brenda talking to a man with his arm in a sling. The bar closed at 2 a.m. on the 1st of June, and Brenda called a friend to pick her up, but they were unavailable. She was standing in the car park when Ted had offered her a lift to Sun Lakes, a near campground where she had planned to spend the weekend. This was the last time she was seen alive. She accepted Ted's offer, got in the car, and they drove away. Brenda didn't fit the pattern of the other missing girls. She was older, and disappeared from a tavern instead of a university campus. And as Brenda was known as a free spirit, being away for periods of time wasn't unusual. So, it took 2 months for her to be reported missing. It was only when they discovered her skull on Taylor Mountain in May 1975, did they link her abduction and murder to Ted. Almost 2 weeks later, on 10th of June, Georgianne Hawkins, an 18-year-old student from the University of Washington, left her sorority house and went to a party on campus with one of her friends. She only stayed out for a short while, because she wanted to go home to study for her upcoming Spanish test. She had walked from the party and got to her boyfriend's frat house at about 12:30 a.m., the 11th of June. She stayed there for about half an hour, she got her test notes and began walking back to her sorority house. She was walking down an alleyway when she encountered Ted. He was using crutches and holding a briefcase. Ted asked Georgianne if she could carry his briefcase for him, back to his VW Beetle car. Georgianne did without hesitation. But once they got to his car, Ted grabbed his crowbar, knocked her unconscious, handcuffed her and placed her in the passenger seat of his car, then drove away. Ted had hit her so hard, that one of her shoes and her earrings were found where she was abducted. Ted drove about 20 minutes on the highway to get to a grassy area. During the car trip, Georgianne had regained consciousness, but could not escape because she was still in handcuffs. They began a conversation. Ted said that Georgianne thought that she was going to make it out alive and attend her Spanish test the next day. But Ted had other plans. Once they got to the grassy area, Ted knocked her unconscious again, and dragged her 10 yards into a small grove. He then stripped her naked and strangled her to death with rope he grabbed from his car. Ted decapitated her head and buried it 25 to 50 yards away from her body. He also dumped her clothes east on Taylor Mountain Road. While the police were busy investigating the missing women cases, the young women in Seattle were scared, so they were told to stay cautious, to travel in pairs or groups and to only use their front doors. During this time, Ted was working for the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, in Olympia, and was assisting the search for the 3 missing women he had previously murdered. While working here, Ted began dating his colleague, Carolyn Boone, a 27-year-old, divorced, single mother from Olympia. Ted was still dating Elizabeth, and neither of the women knew about each other. 1 month later, on the 14th of July, 1974, it was a hot summer's day, and Ted joined 40,000 other people down at the Lake Sammamish State Park, in Issaquah. Ted was seen at 10 a.m., talking to Janice Ann Ott, a 23-year-old, juvenile court worker from Issaquah. Ted asked Janice to help him unload his catamaran boat, which he lied and said it was parked at his parents' house, as he couldn't do it by himself because he hurt his arm playing racquetball. Witnesses heard Janice say to Ted that she would help him, only if she could get a ride in his sailboat. Ted agreed, so Janice picked up her yellow bike and they started walking towards Ted's VW Beetle in the car park. Janice was never seen again. Later that same day, Ted drove back to the lake. He was seen standing by the women's toilets. And it was around 4:30 p.m. when he was seen talking to Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was an office worker and studying software development. Denise was at the beach with her boyfriend and another couple, and when they got there, Denise had taken 4 Valium tablets. After they had lunch, she had gotten up without saying anything and walked over to the restrooms where she was seen talking to Ted. This was the last time she was seen. Ted would later confess that Janice was still alive when he abducted Denise and he forced one woman to watch as he murdered the other. After Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were abducted from the lake, 6 women came forward to the police, stating that a man in a sling was asking for help with his sailboat, but once they got to his car, there was no sailboat. These women saw suspicion and walked away. Police asked for everyone to hand in their photos and videos they took on that day to see if it could help them find a clue or hopefully catch the abductor. The remains of Georgianne Hawkins, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were discovered a few months after they were abducted by a hunter, 1 mile east of an old railroad just outside Issaquah, Washington. The police got a sketch of Janice and Denise's abductor, and once the police released it to the public with his name. Not long after this, Ted packed up his belongings and moved to Salt Lake City in Utah. He asked Elizabeth to move to Utah with him, however Elizabeth was already having suspicions about Ted, so she declines and stays in Seattle. In August of 1974, Ted got accepted into law school at the University of Utah. Almost 2 months later, on the 2nd of September, Ted was driving on the highway near Boise, heading to Salt Lake City, when he picked up a teenage girl who was hitchhiking. Her name is still unknown. Ted confessed to raping her then strangling her to death. Ted returned the next day to take a photograph of her corpse, then dismembered her, before tossing her remains in the river. Her body has still never been found. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Elizabeth called the police about the photo that was released to the public. She told the police that the man they are looking for is Ted Bundy. Elizabeth had actually called the police numerous times before, telling them that she had believed that her boyfriend Ted Bundy was the one abducting the missing women. 1 month later, on the 2nd of October, 1974, Nancy Wilcox, a 16-year-old girl from Holiday, Utah, left her house after having an argument with her father. Ted confessed to seeing Nancy walking in the dark along the side of the road. He forced her into the nearby orchard, strangled her unconscious, removed her clothes and raped her. Ted soon after realized that she wasn't unconscious, he had strangled her to death. So, he dragged her body into a nearby corner and left. When Ted returned to his apartment, he started feeling paranoid, thinking that he had left evidence, so Ted drove back to the orchard, but took some time to find Nancy's body as he was heavily intoxicated. Once he found her body, he picked up her naked corpse and placed in his car, along with her clothes. Ted drove home, back to his apartment, where he waited a day before he disposed her remains near Capitol Reef National Park, almost 4 hours away. Nancy was not reported missing for 3 months, as her parents presumed that she had ran away. Nancy's body has still never been found. 2 weeks later. On October 18, Melissa Smith, a 17-year-old student from Midvale, Utah, was having dinner with her friend at Pizza Parlor in Midvale. At around 9:30 p.m., they finished their pizza and Melissa started walking home by herself. Witnesses heard screams around the Midvale Elementary School area, where Ted most likely abducted her. Ted drove out to Summit Park, where he undressed her, raped her, then strangled her to death. Ted then dragged her naked corpse down the hillside and placed her face down in some scrub oak. Her body was found a week later by 2 hunters. Then on the 31st of October, Laura Ann Aim, a 17-year-old runaway, from Leahy, Utah, was at a Halloween party with her friends. Laura left the party by herself to go buy cigarettes, but where she actually went was unknown. But she was never seen again. Almost 1 month later, on the 26th of November, 2 hikers found Laura's naked body in the mountainous area in American Fork Canyon in Utah. Ted had physically abused her, raped her then strangled her to death. However, the coroner estimated her time of death to the 20th of November, 20 days after she was abducted. 1 week later. On the 8th of November, 1974, Carol D'Aronch, an 18-year-old woman, was shopping in the Murray shopping mall. When Ted approached her disguised as a police officer, he asked her if she drives a Camaro. When she replied yes, Ted replied, "Well, my partner is holding a suspect. This individual tried to get into your car." Ted pulled out his fake badge and they walked across the street to the laundromat's side door, marked 139, to which Ted commented that this was the substation. Once they got to the door, it was locked, and Ted said they had to go down to the main Murray Police Department to sign a complaint. They then walked to his car, a 1986 tan Volkswagen Beetle, and it was here where Carol grew suspicious, but just assumed that he was working undercover, and she got in the car. They drove down a side street and pulled over by an elementary school. Ted stops the car. He grabbed her arm and secured a handcuff around her wrist. Before he could get the other, Carol opened the car door and got out. Ted then jumped out of the car with a crowbar chasing Carol. However, Carol ran to the street waving her hands in the air to a passing car. An elderly couple stopped and drove her to the police department. Carol describes Ted to a police officer. They get a sketch of his face and begin looking for him. Later that same day, Ted abducted Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old girl who was walking to her father's car to go pick up her brothers from the skate park. Ted had taken her before she even got to her father's car. Ted later confessed that after he abducted her, he took her back to his apartment and held her there for a while. He then murdered her and buried her body at a rural site in Fairview Canyon. When police began searching that area, they only found her patella bone. The rest of her body was never found. While Ted was in Utah, the Seattle police have discovered the bones of 4 women found at Taylor Mountain. These women were later identified as Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks and Brenda Ball. All their skeletons revealed that they were murdered by a brutal blunt force trauma. 2 months later. On the 12th of January, 1975, Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old Michigan nurse, was on a holiday with her fiancé and 2 stepchildren at the Wildwood Inn ski resort in Colorado. They had just finished eating dinner at the inn when Karen went back to her room to get a magazine. It was 8 p.m. when she caught an elevator from the lobby to the 2nd floor, and that was the last time Karen's fiancé saw her alive. Ted was waiting on the 2nd floor. He hit her on the head with his crowbar and killed her, raped her, then dumped her nude body 3 miles from the ski resort. Her body was found 1 month later by a local who was driving along the road and noticed on the snowbank that was attracting birds. She walked up to see what it was, when she realized it was a frozen human corpse. 3 months later. On the 15th of March, 1975, Julie Cunningham, a 26-year-old ski instructor from Vail, Colorado, was walking to a local bar to meet a friend. Ted was walking towards her, using crutches and carrying a boot bag. Julie saw Ted struggling and offered to help him. According to Ted's confession, they walked more than half a mile before they got to his VW Beetle, which was parked in the Lion Shed car park. As soon as they got to his car, Ted grabbed his crowbar and knocked her unconscious. He handcuffed her and put her in his car, then began driving towards Rifle. After 1 hour of driving, Julie regained consciousness and started asking Ted questions about who he was and where they were going. They got to Rifle, then he continued his drive out towards Mika. Ted saw a dirt road, and turned onto it, then stopped the car. Julie had gotten her hands free of the handcuffs and tried to get away. Ted grabbed his crowbar and hit her over the head again, hitting her unconscious. He then strangled her with a cord, raped her, then left her body. Ted returned to her corpse 6 weeks later and buried her body. Her body has still never been found. 3 weeks later, on the 6th of April, 1975, Denise Lynn Oliverson, a 24-year-old from Grand Junction, Colorado, had an argument with her husband, so she got on her yellow bicycle and started riding to her parents' house, which was on the other side of Colorado. Denise was never seen again. Ted had somehow lured her into his VW Beetle near the overpass on South 5th Street. He knocked her unconscious with a crowbar, put her in his car, drove 5 miles to the Colorado River where he raped her then strangled her to death. Ted confessed to dumping her body in the Colorado River, to which her body has never been found. On the 5th of May, 1975, Ted drove from Grand Junction, Colorado to Pocatello, Idaho, and checked into a Holiday Inn. Ted had left his room to find his next victim, but after a few failed attempts, he returns back to his hotel alone. The next day, on the 6th of May, Ted parked his VW Beetle outside Alameda Junior High School, where he saw Lynette Culver, a 12-year-old girl, walking alone. Ted approached her and lured her back to his car. Lynette willingly got in the car, and Ted drove them back to his room at the Holiday Inn. Ted later confessed that he drowned Lynette in the bathtub, put her in his car and drove 15 miles out to Snake River where he dumped her body in the river. Her body has still never been found. On the 27th of June, 1975, Susan Curtis, a 15-year-old girl from Provo, Utah, attended a Bountiful Orchard Youth Conference at Brigham Young University. Then after dinner she told her friends that she was going to walk back to her room to brush her teeth. However, she never made it to her room. Somewhere between the Wilkinson Student Center and her dorm, Ted approached her, lured her back to his VW Beetle that was parked in the car park, knocked her out with his crowbar, then handcuffed and placed her body in the passenger seat, and drove 5 miles south, and turned down a dirt road, where he pulled over in a secluded area. He then raped and strangled Susan to death. Her body has still never been found. Ted was causing quite a scare across the 3 states where women were being abducted. Police were doing all they could to try and find the person responsible. However, there were no links to the missing women in Seattle, Utah and Colorado. They weren't related, they didn't know Ted prior to being killed. They weren't a specific age, nor the same occupation, or social status. The only similarity they had was that they were young, attractive females with brown hair. At 2:30 a.m., on the 16th of August, 1975, a police officer from Granger, Utah, named Bob Howard was getting off duty, when he noticed a 1968 tan Volkswagen Beetle parked out the front of a house, where he knew 2 young girls lived. He turned the corner and put his lights on. When Ted noticed the police lights, he started his car and sped off. Ted pulled into a petrol station just up the road. The officer had approached Ted's car, and noticed that his passenger seat was laying in the back seat. Seeing this, the officer grew suspicious and looked through the rest of the car and found what looked like a burglary kit. He had rope, gloves, handcuffs, an ice pick, a ski mask, pantyhose with eyes cut out, a crowbar, and a torch. The officer questioned Ted, asking him why he had all these items in his car, which Ted responded with, "I am a law student, I use them in my classes." Officer Howard arrested Ted for evading a police officer, and took him to the Utah Police Department, but was released on bail the next day. Ted's arrest put him on the radar, and in October 1975, Ted was in a police lineup for the abduction of Carol D'Aronch, the woman who got away. Ted had tried to make himself difficult to identify. He had dressed differently and parted his hair on the other side. When Carol looked at the line of suspects, she immediately noticed Ted as the man who kidnapped her. On the 23rd of February, 1976, Ted sat confidently in the courtroom while he was on trial for kidnapping Carol D'Aronch. He believed that there was no hard evidence to charge him and that he was going to be found innocent. The trial started and Carol took the stand. She was asked to tell her story and if she could recognize her kidnapper. She raised her arm and pointed at Ted, and told the jury that he disguised himself as a police officer and called himself Officer Roseland. The jury looked at Ted, while Ted looked coldly at Carol. Ted denied ever seeing Carol before in his life, however he had no alibi for the day he attacked her. The judge spent the weekend reviewing the case, then 2 days later, the judge handed down the verdict. Ted was found guilty beyond reasonable doubt of kidnapping Carol D'Aranch, and was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison, with the possibility of parole. Ted's arrest had people, who knew him, second questioning, as they knew him as a smart, charming, sweet, likable man who didn't seem capable of kidnapping. While Ted was in prison, the detectives began searching for evidence connecting him to the murders of Karen Campbell and Melissa Smith. They examined his VW Beetle, and the FBI completed forensic testing on strands of hair they had found in Ted's car. The FBI confirmed the hair was a match to Karen and Melissa. The coroner's report on Karen showed that her skull had been hit with a blunt instrument, to which the crowbar found in Ted's car was a positive match. The Colorado police finally had enough evidence to charge Ted with Karen's murder, and they did so, on the 22nd of October, 1976. In April of 1977, Ted was moved from Utah State Prison to Garfield County Jail in Aspen, Colorado, where his murder trial would commence. During his preparation of his murder case, Ted was not happy with his representation and believed his lawyer was incapable, so Ted fired his legal team, and as he was experienced in law, he became his own defense in the case. Being his own defense, this granted him access to the courthouse's library. On the 7th of June, 1977, Ted went to the Pitkin County Jailhouse Library, and while he was in the library, he was alone and unrestrained, so Ted jumped from the second-story window, a 25-foot drop. As soon as they realized that Ted had escaped, the police set up roadblocks around Aspen, and began a search, which included using bloodhounds and 150 people. Ted spent 5 days in the mountains and at the back of Aspen. He lived off food he stole from local cabins and campers. On his 5th day, Ted found a car with its keys still in its ignition. He stole the car and tried to flee Aspen, but he was spotted and captured, and was then charged with escape, burglary and felony theft. He was also ordered to wear handcuffs and leg irons while he conducted his research in the library. Almost 7 months later, on the 30th of December, 1977, Ted placed books on his bed and placed the blanket over the top, to make it appear as if he was sleeping. He then escaped from his cell in the Garfield County Jail in Colorado, through a light fixture. He crawled up into the ceiling and made his way across the building to the jailer's apartment. There was an opening in the closet, to which he changed his clothes, and waited until it was clear. Ted then walked casually out the front door. It was more than 15 hours until the guards noticed he was gone. Ted bought a plane ticket and flew to Chicago, then got on a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he stole a car and drove to Atlanta. He then continued by bus to Tallahassee, Florida. While he was in Florida, he rented an apartment and felt comfortable knowing that no one knew who he was. Ted would spend the next few weeks stealing furniture for his apartment, stealing credit cards which he used to buy food, and then in his spare time, he would wander around the Florida State University, and even attend lectures. Then on Saturday the 15th of January, 1978, Ted ventured onto the Florida State University campus and went over to the Chi Omega sorority house, where he had broken in through the back door and began attacking sleeping women. Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old woman, was sleeping in her bed when Ted bashed her head with a log, so badly that her skull was splintered and a part of her brain was exposed, then strangled her with nylon pantyhose. Then he turned to Lisa Levi, a 20-year-old woman. He hit her unconscious with a log, then raped her. As he was assaulting her, he severely bit her breast which almost severed her nipple off, and he also bit her buttocks, leaving his teeth marks in her. Then he strangled her to death. Evidence was also found that Lisa was sexually assaulted with a hairspray bottle. He then went and bludgeoned 2 women while they were sleeping, Karen and Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner, who fortunately survived the attack. Ted ran out of the sorority house with a log wrapped in cloth. The police were called and arrived shortly after to investigate the crime scene. Then, Ted ventured to an apartment, less than a mile away from the sorority house, where he broke into Cheryl Thomas's room and hit her and attempted to rape her, but fled as concerned neighbors called her room. Ted was now on Florida's FBI's most wanted list. On the 9th of February, Kimberly Leach, a 12-year-old girl, from Lake City, Florida, went to her gym class, but realized she had left her purse in her homeroom. So, she left her class and walked the 250 feet to her homeroom. She grabbed her purse and during her walk back, Ted had encountered her, and told her that one of her family members had been in an accident, and he was sent to pick her up. Around 9:20 a.m., a firefighter saw Ted walking across the school's campus holding Kimberly's arm heading to a white Dodge, which was parked on the street. Kimberly got in the van, and Ted drove away. Forensic analysis later confirmed 2 large blood stains and fires in the Dodge van belonged to Kimberly. It was determined that Ted had cut her throat in the back of the van, using a hunting knife he purchased the day before. He drove out to Suwannee River State Park, where he raped her then dumped her body in a hog pen. She was Ted's last victim. When she never came home after school, her parents called the police, and they were on the search for Kimberly. Authorities were on the look for Ted as there were 2 eyewitnesses that saw him on the school grounds that morning, but at the time, didn't think it was anything suspicious. And on the 8th of February, the day before Ted abducted Kimberly, he attempted to abduct Leslie Parmenter, a 14-year-old girl from Jacksonville, Florida. She was in the Kmart parking lot when Ted approached her dressed as a firefighter. According to Leslie, Ted was fidgety and gave her the creeps, so she tried to walk away, but Ted kept on intercepting her. It was only when Leslie's brother got to the parking lot, and noticed that a man was talking to his sister, he drove over, and asked Ted what he wanted. Ted quickly walked back to his van, and drove away. They wrote down the van's number plate and told their father, the chief detective at the Jacksonville Police Department. When her father ran the plate number, it showed that the van had been stolen from Florida State University, Tallahassee. Leslie also identified Ted from mugshots at the police station, as the man who tried to abduct her. In the meantime, Ted had abandoned the Dodge van and stole a VW Beetle. Then, 6 days later on the 15th of February, police officer David Lee was on patrol when he saw an orange VW Beetle he hadn't recognized before. He ran the plate number, and found out the car was reported as stolen. He put his lights on and followed the VW Beetle, but Ted pulled over and got out of the car, and Officer Lee began to handcuff him. Ted tried to escape, but Officer Lee caught him and took him down to the police station. 2 months into the search, on the 7th of April, they were searching the Suwannee River State Park area. They were 15 minutes into the search, when Trooper Robinson saw an abandoned hog pen. It looked like a metal shed with a wire fence around it. He approached the pen, and investigated inside, to which he saw a tennis shoe. He kept looking, then he saw Kimberly's lifeless body. She still had her jumper on, but was nude from the waist down. Her blue jeans and underwear were piled beside her. As her corpse was in advanced decomposition, it was her dental records that confirmed the body was Kimberly Leach. The detectives were building evidence to charge Ted with Kimberly's murder. So far, they had the Dodge van, 3 key eyewitnesses, Ted's shoe print, semen and Ted's blood type found on Kimberly's underwear. Then on the 31st of July, 1978, Ted was charged with Kimberly's murder as well as the 2 women from the sorority house, Lisa and Margaret. During his murder trial of Kimberly Leach, Ted interviewed his girlfriend Carol Boone, and during his questioning, the 2 were exchanging vows. Under Florida law, a verbal promise made under oath was considered legally married. Soon after his vows, Ted was sentenced to death in the electric chair. During Ted's time on death row, Carol fell pregnant with Ted's child. The day before Ted's execution, he was interviewed by Dr. Keppel, where Ted began to confess of his murders. He confessed that he kept some of his victims' heads and underwear, and he would take photos of the deceased, which he kept in his home as trophies. Ted also confessed that he would often return to his victim's corpse and engage in necrophilia. Ted confessed to murdering 36 women, but professionals believe he is likely responsible for at least 100. On the 24th of January, 1989, Ted was executed in the electric chair. One of America's worst serial killers is now dead. Now America can have some peace of mind, knowing that he is dead, and that Ted can no longer steal the life of another woman.